When I was talking earlier about how nice it is to be here and why it's so nice to be here, I forgot to tell you that I also know your minister, Reverend Sophia from Star Island. And Unitarian-Universalist ministers are a small flock. So we tend to get really close. We get to know one another. We get to love one another. And so when you're invited into a colleague's house to preach, it's like getting to know their family, their church family. So again, it is lovely to be here. As Shar said, I'm retired now. It's another reason why it's great to be out and preaching again. When you don't have to do it every Sunday, you can rediscover the joy in it. The sermon that I'm offering you this morning is an adaptation of a sermon I offered last year out on Star Island when I was Minister of the Week, and Reverend Sophia asked me to bring that to you all. She said she doesn't preach that often about humanism, and I thought I'd give it a try. So here we go. Won't you pray for me? So perspective, I think we can all agree, yes, is a complicated and multivalent thing. My perspective is my perspective. It is shaped by my life experience. Your perspective is shaped by your life experience. And in the middle of all that, we attempt to communicate. I remember my language professor at Hampshire College had a poster on his door, two dolphins looking at each other, and underneath it said, "We know that human beings make eye contact and emit sounds. What we're unclear of is whether actual communication is taking place." And part of the reason for that questioning is because perspective is a complicated and multivalent thing. But it's important for the purposes of this sermon this morning that I be a little bit transparent about my own. So let me begin with just a little about me. I had been a Unitarian Universalist for about 5 or 6 years when I got my call to ministry, which is to say there was a lot about Unitarian Universalism I did not know when I applied to seminary. What I did know, or what I thought I knew, was that Unitarian Universalists were basically a big tent, where people practiced faith from a number of traditions. And I was also aware of how many Unitarian Universalists hailed from Protestant and Catholic backgrounds, but left those faith traditions either because of injury that they suffered there or just some really deep differences in belief. So as Charlene said, I'm culturally Jewish, I'm ethnically Brooklyn, and I'm a bit older than most people think. When I was growing up, schools got out for Christmas and Easter. How many of you remember that? Christmas and Easter vacations, right? Yep. But if we wanted to take off for Yom Kippur, well, we were expected to make up the classwork. During the winter holidays, my neighborhood and every other neighborhood I seemed to travel through was awash in Christmas lights and television broadcast Christmas specials and commercials about, buying all things Christmas. When I visited the local Hallmark store, there were racks and racks and racks of Christmas cards. The Hanukkah selection, on the other hand, was decidedly more limited. And no one at that time was producing chocolate-covered matzahs for us at Passover. This bred in me a somewhat toxic brew of jealousy and disdain for all things Christian. Then I went to college, and while I was in college, became active in work to expose and resist the Ku Klux Klan, a so-called white Christian hate group. Now, armed with all of those experiences and zero actual knowledge about Christianity, I became a devout Christophobe. Fast forward to my call to ministry, I wondered, how would I be able to honor and pastor to all of those who hailed from this dreaded faith tradition? At best, I would probably just dismiss them, but I was seriously concerned about the harm I might do from the framework of my abject ignorance. So I did something that might have been a little bit nuts, but made perfect sense at the time. I applied to and was accepted at a Christian seminary, Andover Newton Theological School, which at the time was not very far from here. I did this in order to overcome my fear of all things Christian, and I did it because I truly believed that being a good UU required me, at the very least, to be able to, tolerate the world's religions, to understand them, and to have some expertise in locating universal values within them. So long story short, I overshot the mark a bit, and 6 years later was ordained into the Christian ministry in the United Church of Christ. Let me just tell you, it was so much easier to come out to my parents as gay than it ever was to come out as a Christian. And bless their hearts, they didn't disown me. A few years after that, the UUA was gracious enough to give me the standing as well, and here I am, and here are all of you, and that is pretty much that for history. I share all of this with you in the hope that it will enable you to understand from my perspective the utter amazement I felt upon my return to the UU fold, wherein it was made very clear to me, in that way that we UUs can be very clear, that not only was my Christian faith not welcomed here, but pretty much any serious discussion about religion, in general, wasn't going to happen. I was so confused, because when I got my call to ministry and began speaking to those wise souls who would mentor me through the process in our faith tradition, who know a thing or two about the process of becoming a UU minister, I was directed to seminary because a Master's of Divinity degree is a requirement for those of us wishing to minister here. In other words, there is no alternative path to ministry in the UUA. One could not minister a UU congregation with a law degree, or a master's in philosophy, or a social work degree, albeit all of those would have been extremely helpful in my 24 years of ministry. But the degree required at the time, if one wished to be a minister in this beloved denomination, was a master's in divinity. Well, how does one acquire such a degree? I'm glad you asked. One attends an accredited seminary or theological school. What do we study there? Another great question. Theology, from the Latin theos, logos, literally a conversation about God, which, interestingly, is also a conversation about humanity's deep thoughts over multiple millennia. And yeah, we study pastoral care and church history, ethics and preaching, but at the end of the day, we are trained as religious professionals. So how was it, I wondered, that I had done all this work, acquired my degree, then jumped through like a gajillion hoops in order to get ordained in the UCC, and then another gajillion hoops to get standing in the UUA, only to find myself in a congregation in which I bore the title appropriate to my training, parish minister, only to be told that my beloved flock had little to no interest in or actual, any use for the knowledge base I was required to have in order to be there. Tell you what, I was never more grateful to have the training I had in that moment and in those early days with my new UU congregation. Instead of reacting to their criticism and warnings by nurture and definitely no small amount of grace, I went into a place of deep reflection. We're taught to do that in seminary. We have a lot of 25-cent words for 10-cent action items. We discern. We think about it. So I went into a place of deep reflection, consciously decided to try to get them into a place of holy curiosity with me. And once there, we began a journey together that is, to this very day, one of the truly great blessings of my life. And when I think back on that particular congregation, I do so confident that we were really good for one another, and I love them all deeply to this day. So what was the stumbling block? I began by asking them what they were there for. Why are you here? And their answer was, you know the answer. Community. Wonderful. I get that. I said, but you can find community elsewhere. Why have you chosen to find it here? Well, they'd say, we like the people here, and, we like the former minister. I knew all that, or at least I had figured as much. After all, I had a master's in divinity degree and was an ordained minister. It's not like I didn't know why some folks went to church. But I asked them to dig a little deeper with me, and as we explored together what made this community different from other communities, we started getting into some really sweet discussions. Deep and meaningful conversations about our hopes and desires, about our highest ideals and how hard it is sometimes to live them out, about the things that exist just beyond the edge of our knowing, as well as the things that remain totally mysterious. In short, we began engaging in religious discussion, covering topics of faith humans have wrestled with since the recording of history, and I imagine well before that. So one day, after I'd been there a while and had a general but pretty sure sense they were no longer threatening the search team who had brought this Judeo-Christian into their midst, I worked up the courage to ask them the question I was still wrestling with. Why are you all so resistant to anything that carries even a whiff of anything religious? Because we're humanists, came the response. Well, for the love of God, say I, or, whoever it is you do with that. What does that have, for the love of God, or not, what does that have to do with it? They said, well, we don't believe in God. Some of us are just not sure about God, but mostly we don't believe in God. Well, say I, that makes you atheists or you agnostics. But tell me more about your understanding of humanism. What followed was enlightening. I have to confess, a little disappointing. Most of those who identified as humanists had come to Unitarian-Universalism from other traditions with which they had had a significant falling out. They came to Unitarian-Universalism seeking another way, but soon found out that seeking a new way wasn't really required until the stories eventually morphed into, and tell me if this sounds familiar, we came here to leave all that there. In truth, they really had no idea what a humanist was. It had become code for, I have no interest in anything religious, when in truth, they had plenty of appetite for matters of religion, so long as that religion wasn't inextricably tied to ancient creeds and doctrines, which seemed to them, and seemed to me as well, out of place in a postmodern society. Well, newsflash, the first humanists felt exactly the same way, and they articulated as much in the first Humanist Manifesto. Written in 1933, they said, going to talk about a message, a timeless message, one that could be well used in our own time as well, right? Humanist Manifesto, 1933, they wrote, "The time has come for widespread recognition of the radical changes in religious beliefs throughout the modern world." The time is past for mere revision of traditional attitudes. Science and economic change have disrupted the old beliefs. Religions the world over are under the necessity of coming to terms with new conditions created by a vastly increased knowledge and experience. Can I get an amen? If you ever wondered where the idea of a living tradition came from, here it is. But they were not anti-religious. In fact, the first Humanist Manifesto was, in the words of its authors, intended to be a new statement of the means and purposes of religion. They wrote that, while their age owed a vast debt to the traditional religions, it is nonetheless obvious that any religion that can hope to be a synthesizing and dynamic force for today must be shaped for the needs of this age. To establish such a religion is a major necessity of the present. We wouldn't know anything about that. It is a responsibility which rests upon this generation. We therefore affirm the following, and they went on to set forth 15 affirmations that defined this new faith tradition. And if you're ever looking for a really fun adult ed thing to do together, I recommend that you pull that manifesto up and go through those traditions. You will learn more about yourself, and one of the roots of this faith tradition that doesn't get a whole lot of attention and should, in my opinion. And I am, after all, an ordained minister, so. But I love that manifesto. I love the language in it, and I give thanks to God, as is my right as a UU, for the humanist branch of our UU tree. They warn us against idolatries of the mind and spirit and encourage us not to bind ourselves to the past, but rather wrestle with the ever-unfolding truths before us. Humanism may, in fact, be largely credited for the fact that ours is a living tradition, and that living tradition is now giving rise to a rewrite of Article 2 of our Constitution. Are you familiar with this? Perhaps you've seen the little jet pig? Kind of makes me laugh. JETPIG, and yes, if you haven't seen it, it's a little cute pig with a jetpack and a helmet and goggles on. It's very cute, it's very UU. But JETPIG help us remember the 6 values: justice, equity, transformation, pluralism, interdependence, and generosity. See, it works. And all of these live around love, which dwells at the center. So yes, I've made fun of it before, but it's largely due to the fact that the jet pig's really kind of cute. In truth, the poking fun is nothing more than pure jest on my part, because in fact, I believe the rewrite of Article 2 was and is critical to our future. If you leave with nothing else this morning, I hope you take this with you. That Unitarian-Universalist, I hope the roof doesn't come in when I say this, because I'll have a lot of apologizing to Reverend Sophia to do. Unitarian-Universalism is not a humanist faith. Humanism is one of many faith traditions that lives in this big tent of Unitarian Universalism among many other faith traditions. I appreciate that fact. I appreciate that humanism has and contributes to this great faith of ours. I would just ask that those humanists might, bless us lone tunnelers, those rare individuals whose joy and passion it is to dig mysterious tunnels beneath the surface of the earth, who share the soulful purpose of moles and worms, who labor gleefully beneath our feet while we bask in the sun or gaze at the stars, whose pockets and cuffs are full of soil, who dig faithfully in the darkness, turning left, turning right, not knowing why or where, but absorbed and fulfilled nevertheless. I count myself among those dwellers, but it is always good to be among people worshiping from diverse strands of faith. It is why I am a Unitarian Universalist, and even in the Christian circles that I serve, I am known as a UU Christian because of the way I interpret Christianity, which they let me do and ordained me. Who knew? But we have work to do. We have work to do to be welcoming and affirming to all who come through our doors. This is a time and a place where toxic individualism has run amok, where people are feeling isolated and alone, and they are looking not only for places of community, but for places of deep spiritual connection. The beauty of being Unitarian Universalists is we get to define that now in our time. Take that page from the manifesto. Make it now, make it new, make it fresh, but don't just close the door on it because of a bad experience elsewhere. Because I don't think that's going to enable us to live into the richness that this tradition can offer. That's my takeaway. Thank you for listening. Thank you for having me here with you this morning. So may it be. Blessed be. Namaste. And amen.